ecofictologists, welcome back to my channel and welcome back to another episode of Spells and Specialists, the show where we use magic and stories to communicate science and teach technical topics. I flipped those two things around, but we're going to keep going. Doesn't really matter. Yes, I mean, if you're on my channel, you probably know who I am. My name is Lovis, and I nerd out all about ecofiction and reading it, writing it, and how it can be used as a science communication tool. And with me here today is my co-host, C.R. Rowanson from The Magic Engineer. Do you want to introduce yourself, Clark?
Absolutely, yeah. I'm C.R. Rowanson, the Magic Engineer on YouTube, where I talk about all magic systems all the time. In general, I just love everything story related. I just have a soft spot and for magic, and there's kind of a gap, so that's what I like to talk about.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in this episode, but for now, we are super excited to welcome Navarre Bartz onto the show. And we're so happy to welcome you to this episode of Spells and Specialists. And he's going to talk to us all about whatever the heck energy materials are. And we're going to have to start from scratch. But do you want to introduce yourself briefly, Navarre?
Sure. Hey, everybody. I'm Navarre Bartz. I do a few different things. My main day job is as a stay-at-home parent these days, but I have a background in ceramic engineering and researching energy materials, as Lovis said. And I'm excited to be here to talk with you and Clark today.
Excited to have you here.
Excellent. Yeah.
So do you want to ask the obvious question, or should I?
Well, no, you know what? You go for it. Usually I love the first question. You can go for it this time.
So what do you mean by energy materials?
So the way I think of it, there are probably plenty of different definitions here, but the way I think of an energy material is it's a material that you use to cause a transformation. Either in a solar panel, you have either silicon or one of the more exotic materials will transition a photon, your light energy, into electricity, or the same sort of thing with phonons for a thermoelectric material. And then there are other weird things out there, and something that's kind of electricity to motion, like the piezo that most people have as a vibration motor in their phone. That's an energy material too. It's just you're using electricity to cause a thing instead of the other way around. But the effect does work both ways.
Okay. I wasn't clear if you were talking about that kind of like solar panel power source type stuff or energetics as in propellants and explosives. So
I have not done work on that. One of the companies I worked for did both batteries and energetic materials as well. So yeah, there's also that. Again, you're doing the same sort of thing. So I think you could consider that also to be energy materials, but the transfer happens on a lot shorter time scale. It's a matter of kinetics.
Okay.
I feel like this is going to be a little bit more Clark's wheelhouse because words like photon and phonon are not ones that I use in my day-to-day life so much. So photon, you said, was light energy, and phonon is thermoelectric energy. So heat.
Yeah, so it's heat. Yeah, it's basically this a quanta of heat, if you want to get all.
A quanta.
Yeah.
Okay.
A single unit of heat is a phonon, but I feel like I don't have as good a handle on it as I do photons, because I feel like.
How do you spell that?
It's PHONON instead of the T. It's
awesome.
Basically
okay.
the same. And
He's
I
Googling.
guess
no, I'm putting it in notes and interesting terms and phrases.
I'll caveat everything I say here with it's been a couple years since I was actively involved, so there may be slight inaccuracies, but hopefully the 30,000 foot view will be still accurate.
Hey, that's fine. I have a background in chemistry, and I will occasionally talk about it, and then I will look things up later and find out that I got it wrong. But nobody's like called me out or crucified me yet.
Oh, now that you've said that, they're going to go back through your stuff.
Yeah, they're going to troll through everything.
Poke holes
where
now.
was he wrong?
And there are new papers all the time, and you can't keep up on it all anyway. So
No, absolutely not.
you're bound to be wrong at some point. So
Yeah. So you worked with photons. What did you work on specifically?
so I did a few different things. Probably most of my research was actually about uh, battery materials, which are converting chemical to electrical energy and back. Um, and then capacitors, which are closely related, but are more of a physical storage medium until you get into electrolytic capacitors, which are sort of things are more of a spectrum than discrete once you start getting into how you store energy, which isn't immediately evident, but electrolytic double layer capacitors are kind of like a weird mix of battery and capacitor. But
So,
I did do some photonics stuff as well, although a lot more on the thermal side, where we were taking. So they have evacuated glass tubes they'll use to make solar hot water off of your roof. Um, and then you can store that in a water tank just like you would a regular water heater, or they make these hybrid water heaters that are electric or solar. Um, so we were actually looking at if you're producing a lot of hot water, usually you size your system to give you hot water in winter. So in the summer, you have a lot of residual heat energy. So we were looking at using thermoelectric devices to pull that power back out and generate more electricity during the summer from that. Um, at least the state of the tech at the time, it wasn't very practical. You could, I think it was like 1% we calculated we could get back out. So it wasn't really worth the added expense at the time, but that was 15 years ago now. So it may be better.
okay. Well, all right. Lot of questions. I'm just taking notes already. Okay, so there are a couple of important things that I want to make sure we get clarified because you talked about how you worked on um, both batteries and capacitors. So first off, can you clear up the difference between those? Because those are both ways of storing electrical power, but what is the difference?
Yeah. So kind of if we zoom out a little bit, like the main three electrochemical or close to electrochemical storage mediums, and I kind of came into this from the solar power and how do you store that when it's shady kind of thing. So the one everyone's familiar with is a battery, and you have both rechargeable and non-rechargeable batteries. So like most AA's are not rechargeable. And what happens in that is you have an anode and a cathode and an electrolyte. So the anode and cathode are basically your two materials, and they're connected to a current collector if they're not a metal themselves. And as you either charge or discharge, parts of that little ions will break off and move to the other side of the reaction, and there'll be a separator, which doesn't really do anything. It's not active, but it's in there to keep everything from shorting out, which is bad. As you might have noticed
bad.
from some of the, that's basically what's happening in a lot of the electric car fires, is that lithium ion batteries are particularly bad about when they, well, I'll try to use my hands and see if it messes up the blurring of the background. But so as the lithium ions are moving, they're plating on usually a graphite. I'm going to probably say the wrong one. We'll say just the graphite electrode, because I can never remember which one's the cathode and anode unless I'm looking at it.
Same. I also just go with electrode.
You'd think as a battery researcher I would remember,
electrodes.
but yeah, you'd think as a battery researcher I would remember, but I don't. But anyway, your lithium goes from, usually it's a lithium compound. I think people want to do it out of pure lithium, but it's not really a good idea right now. But then you have usually graphite over here. Although people want to make that silicon or graphene to increase the storage capacity. But basically your lithium breaks off as an ion, kind of floats across the separator and goes over here. But over time, lithium likes to form dendrites. And so either when you're replating or plating, usually it's, I think when you're replating on the original, like your lithium cobalt or whatever, it'll form these dendrites, which are basically like lithium icicles. and they're sharp and pointy because you're doing this like basically an atom at a time. So they'll puncture that separator, and then your two opposite plates are then directly electrically connected inside the cell, which is not good.
No
It's
bueno.
like a
Okay.
stalactite.
Yeah, yeah. And for most lithium chemistries, that's pretty catastrophic, and they have something called thermal runaway. So once they start heating up, they keep heating up, um, and then you end up blowing the whole pack, or at least a good chunk of it,
Yeah.
because it'll start heating up the other batteries. Lithium iron phosphate is interesting in that that chemistry actually arrests that, so it's a lot safer chemistry because it can't thermal run away. Um,
So you mentioned there were three kinds of storage.
yeah, so
Battery is
batteries.
physical storage of the actual electrons, right?
Yeah, so well, it's chemical storage. So the electrons go in and then they cause a chemical reaction to happen. So that's what causes the ions to move back and forth as the reaction is happening inside that electrolyte. Capacitors are more physical, where the simplest form of capacitor is, again, you have a separator and two plates, and you're just dumping electrons in there, and they accumulate on one side. And so you can only store so many, but you have a separator in there, so it kind of stores electrons on one side and holes on the other.
Yeah, it builds it
Holes.
up in the
Yeah,
electromagnetic field between them, right?
right, right. And then electrolytic capacitors are kind of a hybrid where you're storing charge in the plates, but you also have an electrolyte, and the electrolyte then forms a second layer of charge within it, sometimes with a little bit of, and this is one that, again, it's been a while, so someone can fact check me and be angry in the comments about it.
I'm sure they will.
But basically, electrolytic capacitors are kind of a hybrid where they do store some in the electrolyte and some on the plates. So they're very fast since you're not having that chemical reaction happen. A capacitor, you can push charge in and out really, really fast because it's basically just sitting there as electrons, but you can't store a whole lot because you have some more physical limitations of what's going on there.
Okay. I'm gonna hold on.
Okay.
This is taking me way back to physics class, which I ran so fast away from. Physics and chemistry, both of them I ran really far away from once I got out of high school. So this has taken me back quite a long way. So let me just make sure I get this. A battery is a chemical storage because it has an electrolyte and the ions are moving through the electrolyte.
The transfer happens via chemical reactions.
Yeah, so
yeah, okay.
I'm trying to think of a less jargony way to say it.
But in general, chemical reactions are like a atomic or molecular game of telephone, where they have to like bump into each other and pass stuff along. At least in this case, is they have to bump into each other, and that's how it gets transferred across.
Okay.
And again, it has also been a long time for me. Whereas capacitors, it's in the field between the plates, and that's where there's a slower release of the energy with batteries. Whereas with capacitors, the entire charge is released almost instantaneously. Yeah, it's an impulse reaction.
And there's no electrolyte in a capacitor?
There can or cannot. It depends.
Because you have electrolytic capacitors, right?
There's always a separator of some kind because, again, you don't want the plates to touch and shorten internally. Whether that's an electrolyte or not depends on the type of capacitor.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure.
Okay. And the shorting happens when the ions break off and poke holes into the separator and form dendrites.
Yeah.
Icicles.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, icicles are stalactites, like Clark was saying, which might be a more apt comparison since they're not.
I like that image. I like the lithium icicles or stalactites. I like that image.
Okay, so those are the different forms of storage mediums, and you said you mostly worked with batteries?
Mostly batteries, and probably equally batteries and capacitors. Fuel cells are, I know how they work, but they're not something I worked on directly myself. And I also, yeah,
So what
I've
types?
done a
Sorry,
lot
go
of
ahead.
little stuff, but
What types of
the
batteries are there?
uh, how long do you
Well,
have?
because
Um,
I know there
lots,
are some
but
basic chemical ones. There's the term thermal batteries, which is something that I've
mhm.
never really looked into. So like in
One
those
of
broad categories, how many are there, and what are some of them, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, again, it probably depends on how fine you want to split hairs. The
High
place
level
I
let me
worked
talk.
makes a lot of thermal. One of the places I worked did thermal batteries. Thermal batteries, basically, the electrolyte is a solid until it gets to a certain temperature. Um,
Okay.
so they had them. I don't. Yeah, I didn't have clearance or anything, so anything I tell you isn't like protected. Uh, so
I wasn't even thinking about that, but now I am. Now
no,
I'm
no, I
wondering
didn't.
what you know.
Yeah, no, it was a company that does a lot of military and medical contracts, but none of I was just an intern, so I didn't have any kind of clearance or anything. But the thermal batteries are usually for like emergency type stuff. So like one of the applications they made batteries was for ejection seats
Hmm.
to start that system. The battery had, I don't know the exact chemistry since I wasn't on that unit, but um, basically you would like pull the cord on the ejection seat and it would cause whatever, probably an energetic material of some type, but not quite explosive, just got hot really fast, um, to melt the electrolyte, which was probably, usually those are some kind of molten salt. And then once you say on an ejection seat, which is one of the applications, you like pull your cord, it starts a reaction that heats the cell up and turns that into a molten salt. So now it's a liquid, but only at really high temperature. And the advantage of that is you can have it sitting on a shelf for decades and it doesn't degrade at all because the reactions can't happen. Um, Unlike where with you have your double A's or whatnot, and they have the expiration date on the side because they have that liquid electrolyte. So there's always a little bit, even when you're not pulling power out, there's always a little bit of a reaction happening there.
Okay. Okay.
Is that why it goes kind of like green and gunky when they've been sitting there for a little while? Is that like a leak of the electrolyte?
Yeah, that's an electrolyte leak. So I think most double A's use, I think some kind of hydroxide. I can't remember the exact chemical they use for their electrolyte, but I think it's usually because they're alkaline cells, so it's an alkaline solution that's the electrolyte in there.
Can you just elaborate on what alkaline solution means?
Yeah, so when we're talking about alkaline, we're talking back to pH. So you have acidic and alkaline. So alkaline is going to be your higher pH is above 7, and acidic is below 7. So yeah, an alkaline battery tends to have an alkaline electrolyte, unsurprisingly, um, since they're old enough to have sensical names for things uh, before they got overly elaborate.
Practical. Let's just
Mhm.
keep it to practical names.
Yeah.
Okay.
And what kind of battery is in a solar panel?
So solar panel doesn't have a battery in itself, um, but a lot of them do have storage. That's kind of the big
Right.
debate right now is how to store that, whether to do it with batteries or just do it like they've always done grid storage with pumped hydro, where you pump a bunch of water up a hill into a pond and then run it down through turbines when you need more energy and then pump it back up when you have residual, which is how most grid storage in the United States is done because we have a lot of land and uh, a
Okay.
decent amount of water. Uh,
So
which is,
the excess electricity that is converted from the photons, the light energy, gets pumped into the grid. So it's not stored on site so much, or
yeah, so when you have a
when
solar panel, it just generates electrons and then you have to do something with them.
something.
If you don't, they can overheat, which I was on the solar car team a million years ago. And For silicon cells, it wasn't as much of a problem, but the gallium arsenide cells that we sometimes used, which are just different chemistries of this, they're all semiconductors, like in your computer, but they're arranged a little differently, basically. But the gallium arsenide cells were more efficient, but because they're 30 or 40% efficient as opposed to the silicon cell, you think that'd be better. But that meant they were generating power, and if you didn't pull the electrons out, then they would still turn to heat. But it was a lot worse than if it was just getting warm. So we had to use while the car was not going down the road, if we stopped it, or if it was going slowly enough, like if we were in a parade, we would have someone with, I don't think we were fancy enough to have a backpack sprayer. I think we just had one of those ones you carried that were like the little pump sprayers, and they would spray down the cells, and you could kind of watch the water evaporate off because it was getting too hot, because
Oh my goodness.
the car was built to where it could hit like 60 or 70 miles an hour. But if it was going really slowly, we were generating a lot more power than we could use, and it started to build up heat pretty badly, especially since the body of the car was made of composites, so they're not exactly the best thermal conductors.
Right.
But
Oh
yeah,
my goodness.
so solar is the same as it's a different process that generates the electrical current there. That's the photoelectric effect, which made Einstein famous.
So
Originally,
what do you generally do with the energy as it's produced through solar cells then?
I mean, a lot depends on what kind of solar we're talking about. But for, say, grid scale, like Lovis said, you just put it into the grid, or what a lot of people might see maybe in their neighborhoods is rooftop solar. So, I don't know about in the UK, but here in the States anyway, if people have rooftop solar, most people are on what we call a grid tie system. So it generates the power during the day, and sort of your house gets first dibs on it. And then any power above what your house uses just goes back out to the grid. And ideally, this is very state by state, you get paid a certain amount for that power you generate, which is, I don't think anybody is 1-to-1. So you get some tiny amount that's less than what you would pay the utility for back for whatever you generate.
Well, yeah, gotta turn.
Yeah, at the moment, the profit on those, or what you get out of them, is minuscule.
Yeah, and it depends a lot on state. The payback period on your solar panels depends a lot on how much power you use, and also a lot on what state you live in, because each state has different rules, all the way down to you don't get anything if you feed it back to the grid. Yeah, there are some states that really don't want the solar industry there.
Yeah.
So that starts straying away from technical topics into political ones. But anyway,
sometimes they're one and the same.
Yeah. Unfortunately.
Yeah. So what makes, because sometimes I don't know very much about solar panels, but I'm assuming that there are different types, and some, like the ones we have up in Scotland, they're marketed as being like, oh, well, we'll pull electricity even on a cloudy day, which, we get a little bit of cloud up in Scotland. And are there different solar panels? Like, are they made differently in order to be able to work properly on a cloudy day versus other types that work on sunny days in places where most days are sunny?
Not really, just from economies of scale. Each different material has a slightly different what's called a band gap. And stepping back to chemistry again, so you have your atomic chemistry. So you have your atom, and you have your electron cloud and whatnot. So you have your main shell, and then you also have your valence bands and all that fun stuff. And the band gap is essentially the amount of energy that it takes to bump the electron up to the next shell and then fall back down. It's more complicated than that, but
We'll
it's
stick
not
with
worth.
that though,
Yeah,
because I
it's
don't
not
know
worth
if we
getting
can.
into because that should be enough for broad strokes. Um, and so I think the only real big distinction there to make, well, maybe two. So one is that depending on the material, that band gap's a little bit different, and that kind of tells you what the ideal wavelength is for the energy coming in, because the wavelength will have a specific energy. Um, so that'll be better, but anything above that will work. But if it's not enough, then it won't bump it up.
Okay.
And then so like I think for silicon, it's what 1.8 electron volts or something. Um, and then different materials will have different. And then you may hear people talk about multi-junction solar cells. And what those are is each. So a junction is basically uh, in a silicon cell, it's all the same material. So it's all silicon, and one we say doping. One is doped slightly different than the other one. And then you stick them next to each other, and it's just a different material you're putting into the matrix to put one at a little bit negative and one at a little bit positive. And then when your photon comes in, it activates that difference, and it causes the electrons to move from one to the other and create a current.
Doping.
So you're,
It's
yeah,
fun.
that's what we say in ceramic engineering when we add additives to our
I mean,
This
it
is
makes
going way
sense.
back, but I believe
materials.
doping in general is just it's impurities in a I don't remember if it's impurities in a solid structure, right? Because we would talk
Yeah,
about
well,
doping.
we call them dopants if we're putting them there on purpose, and we call them impurities if they're
For
not.
an accident.
Is usually our distinction. But
Both
yeah, so you have
both drop down the purity of the substance. One is
yeah,
intentional.
yeah, one's on purpose and one is not.
I
And
see.
and presumably a lot of the interesting effects we discovered on accident from uh, what we thought were contaminants, but that that that's another story. But yeah,
And
so that's basically how the solar panels work. Is you're basically creating again a positive and a negative electrode, and then but instead of having ions moving, you're actually putting light through it. But if you have a multi-junction cell, then you have that, but then you have others, and you kind of stack them up in a layer, and those will be more than just one material. Um, and with that, because the band gap is a little bit different for each material, you can start stacking them, and the first layer will catch this wavelength, and then the next will catch this other wavelength, and you can get a
That's cool.
more complete picture. It's not really a picture, but you get a more complete chunk of the spectrum out
yeah,
as useful energy.
and
But it's a lot more expensive to make it that way, which is why silicon is still the dominant residential
yeah,
type of cell, where in space-based, which is where you get your like gallium arsenides and some of your more exotic materials, if you're in space, because it's so expensive per weight, you want as small of an array as you can get. Um, per, yeah, so basically you want a smaller array if you can, because it's so even still it's cheaper than it used to be, but it's still ridiculously expensive to launch stuff into space. So
and the
As
other
it should
thing
be.
the other thing you have to think of with the solar panels is where you're at in the globe,
Mhm.
because not just the band gap of your specific panel, but the amount of direct sunlight you're able to get. And that's where some of the facets of the panels you can install in your house matter. They talk about the different axis tracking, and basically what that's doing is making it so that the solar panel can move so that it is remaining perpendicular to the sun for as long as possible to increase the efficiency of the energy uptake. But the cloudiness of the day, the season, basically, because depending on how far close you are to the sun from the tilt of the Earth and where you're at, all matters. Like the most consistent you can get is actually like right on the equator if you were in the desert. That because there you're going to have very little cloud cover. It will be the same pretty much every day. Where I was in California was also highly effective because again it was in the middle of the desert, so clouds maybe a dozen days a year. Not quite that bad, but mostly sunny days. And with where we were at um, in the valley and the way I'm getting too technical, but those are different. Those are different things that you have to consider, and that's part of why, in general, the same solar panels would be more effective where I was in California than they would be for you in Scotland, because of the thickness of the atmosphere, depending on your elevation, how much weather we had, and then um, because we were in the desert near the coast, the time of year had less of an impact on the quality of sunlight we got. Not no
Gotcha.
impact, but less of an impact since like Scotland is higher in latitude, it's a bigger swing between seasons.
It is a big swing between seasons.
Yeah, that ends up going back to what we call capacity factor, which is like how much. So like any kind of renewable that's intermittent, like wind or solar, gets graded also on capacity factor. So you have like 100-watt solar panel, which wouldn't be very big, but you have a maximum capacity of what the device can output, but then you also have a reasonable expectation of how much of the time it can actually produce that maximum amount, which in Scotland is going to be a lot less than in California or Arizona or the Sahara, something like that. So the capacity factor is very dependent on where you are.
Thank you. I couldn't remember the term.
Yeah, in theory, you could probably make a solar panel that was really efficient in cloudy weather based on like what wavelengths come all the way through versus not, but I don't know if it'd be worth it though.
I didn't even think of the overheating factor, because that would just be fascinating in terms of what is really effective in one area might be dangerously effective in another.
Yeah, as long as you're pulling the power out, then they don't. I mean, they still get warm because any device is going to have waste heat, but
Right.
any as long as you're pulling power out, it's fine. I don't know what would happen to an array if the grid went down in the middle of a really sunny day in Arizona or West Texas and you couldn't dump the power out of the cells. I would think it would be bad.
I bet that they probably just go straight to ground, honestly, because they're the huge solar farms in Nevada, outside of Vegas, and they have to have prepped for that. They don't want all of those to explode and catch fire. If that gets broken somehow, that I hope they have a backup plan.
One would hope they have a backup plan, but I mean, we'll see.
You never know, I guess.
Yeah.
That's a terrifying thought. And on that terrifying thought, I think I'm gonna
Lots of rich story ideas, though.
Yeah, I know. It's fertile ground for the next section, which is probably why I'm gonna stop our absorbing of crazy cool chemistry stuff, because I knew very little about any of this before we started, and now I feel like I know a little bit more. I would probably have to look at my notes if I were to talk to anybody about this. But I have a lot of them, which means I heard a lot of really interesting stuff. But what I want to know from you, Navarre, is what would be the main things that you would want people to take away from anything that we've discussed so far? What would be the main take-home messages if somebody was trying to understand this field of study? Condense everything you've said in the last half hour into 3 sentences, please. Go.
You'd think I would have prepared better for this, but I didn't. I was too busy thinking about other things of what are the things I want to hit. Well, I think all of these things kind of go back to that idea of transformation, and that regardless of whether it's the photoelectric effect or electrolytic or any other type of chemical storage or any of it, it's all about kind of transferring energy from one form to another, and I guess everything that comes with that, including the of course always the enemy of heat, unless you're transferring to heat energy, in which case you're golden. But
So energy management is all about energy transformation and transfer. It sounds like what you're saying.
Yeah, because
Okay.
any of these materials can go from any form of energy to another form, and obviously the chemical and electrical for batteries, and the light and electrical for photoelectrics are the two that are probably most relevant for our upcoming electrification age.
Yeah, I can see how that would be relevant. And everyone watching will be able to, relate to, okay, well, everyone has seen a battery, right? Everyone has
Yeah.
seen a AA battery, and everyone has been hearing about renewable energies and solar panels on their roof. So they'll be able to kind of latch onto those concepts and realize that it is that it applies to their lives, kind of. That's how everything in your house works.
Yeah,
Even
and
if we don't want to think about it too hard.
And it's not quite as fancy, and I don't know if I guess it comes back down to how you're splitting hairs. But if you've ever been in a car or a train, like a lot of those still use their energy transformation, but they're not as direct, maybe.
Right.
Which kind of goes back to your waste heat and why electrification is so much more efficient, is you basically have fewer hops for transferring that energy. But yeah, fossil fuels are just another medium of storing energy. So
Yeah. Yeah. Our cars are chemical storage into mechanical energy is what we do. That's what the whole, that's what the internal combustion is. We don't need to go into a whole side thing with that. Whereas here we're dealing with the transformation specifically of electron energy and movement of electrons.
Ooh.
Okay.
Okay.
Any other take-home messages? Because one of the things that came up frequently that I think is a very important piece of information is just the fact that everything has inefficiencies, and a lot of times that's heat waste. But like every system has inefficiencies, which we don't really think about with solar panels. Like even I knew that conceptually and from a whole bunch of other stuff I've done, but I hadn't thought about it in terms of solar panels and the efficiencies of the crystal until you walked us through that solar car example. I was like, oh, of course.
Yeah, it's definitely not something I thought about, because when I joined the team, I was like, why are you guys spraying the car?
This seems like a bad idea.
Yeah, it's like, should we be adding water to the electrical systems? That seems like, does not seem like a
hair
good
dryer
idea.
and bathtub. No.
Yeah, it felt like that, but luckily everything was properly waterproofed.
Oh.
Yeah,
let's just
water and electricity are not fun things to mix. No, I don't. No. Don't try this at home.
Don't recommend. That's the other take-home message. Don't do this at home.
Do not try this at home. I mean, I can put that down.
It's dangerous, guys.
But yeah, was there anything else when we do this? It's like to see if we can get 3, because then as we move forward through the other stages, we usually end up homing in on 1 with some minor incorporation of the others.
Yeah, one thing that I think might have maybe some implications toward a magic system is all of these systems, at least to get useful work out of them. Because I mean, you can run an electrochemical reaction and not get work out of it, but that's not as interesting, maybe, as for day-to-day life anyway. It's great if you want to write a paper, but I think to get useful work out, you end up needing these 2 opposing charges to be able to. You need your anode and your cathode, or your 2 different dope junctions in a solar cell to be able to get useful work out of the system and hook it into something.
So more about how it would work would be a good take-home message. Kind of the mechanics of it, for want of a better word, kind of like how things work within the system with the 2 opposing charges and the movement of ions and the reactions and stuff.
Yeah, because you have the transfer happening, but then you also kind of, by putting these electrodes in there, you're kind of interfering with you're inserting yourself as an interloper into the reaction to get useful work out of it, as opposed to it just happening in the world.
So something you said there triggered some other memories. Because I was just double checking it to make sure that I wasn't completely off my rocker. But the physics definition of work is all about energy transfer that occurs during movement. Because that was a really fun thing. One of our teachers, well, fun I say, annoying, but it's a lesson that stuck with me. Is they would ask if you sat there pushing against a wall for hours, did you do any work? And your automatic reaction is like, yeah, because I'm exhausted. The actual answer is no, because nothing moved. Energy was spent, but work was not done. So going back to what you said, like it seems like in order to really make any kind of work happen, there has to be movement.
Mhm.
Here we're talking about movement of electrons and chemical energy. We're talking about the movement of energy, but it still holds. Movement has to happen for work to be done. Otherwise, the energy is just expended.
Well, for some reason, I'm making really depressing parallels between like an unproductive day at work where you don't actually get
Let's
anything
not go
done, and
there.
you're like, have I done any work today? And
Let's not go
technically,
there.
as physics defines it, no.
So we call it work, but what people are actually paying you for is for your energy. Um,
Yeah,
that's what they're actually paying you for. It's like, oh yeah,
yeah.
I
So if I'm
expended my
tired, I've done
energy
work.
today. Whether work was done, I mean,
That's a whole other
the
story.
yeah.
the work discussion reminds me of something that I think maybe I just wasn't far enough along because I took the class a little earlier than some of the other people in my department, so I wasn't as ingrained. But the engineering side and the chemistry side see work from opposite sides. So when you do thermodynamics, um, one side says, okay, if work is done on the system, then that's positive. But the other side says if work is done by the system, it's
Uh,
positive. And so some people had we had some crossover
Yep.
between the material science department and chemistry for some of our thermo classes. And some of the people who had already had more thermo than I when we took the chemistry one were like freaking out and not okay shifting the reference frame over what was positive and what was negative work, because the engineers and the chemists looked at it from the opposite sides of the coin.
Interesting.
And
That's
it
funny.
it comes down to the definition of the system, and if people aren't
Mhm.
abundantly clear with that, then that gets very confusing very quickly.
Yeah, I can also see where they're coming, but I just feel like they kept harping on it for like the whole semester, and I was like,
They're not okay.
it's like just
You gotta let it go and move on, guys.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I think most people were fine, but there are a couple guys who are just like, no. It's like it's a different department, different rules. Just
So what we've got, the three take-home messages that we're going to kind of consider and as we move forward are energy management is about energy transformation and transfer. Like
Mhm.
those are the things you really need to pay attention to, which now that I think about it, that makes sense. Everything you were talking about with the grid, with the like what the solar panels are doing, what the piezoelectric crystals are doing, it's all transformation. Everything has inefficiencies and waste heat, especially when you're dealing with energy. And just to get useful work, you need opposing charges and forces, and work is done via movement. Does that
Sounds good
sound
to
Sounds
me.
good to me.
okay? I kind of plucked a couple of those like out of the
Yeah.
interstitial tissue of our conversation, so I hope those are what you're
Yeah,
going for.
I think so. I think that yeah,
Awesome.
I think that was good reading between the lines. It was there.
It was
I
there.
just
It was
I
there.
just didn't know how to articulate it. So.
Well, that is why we are all here.
Yes.
So now that we have those take-home messages for what we would want to communicate, let's talk a little bit about the goals of communicating. What are you trying to achieve by communicating these three things? Are you trying to change people's minds? Are you trying to educate people because there's a lot of misinformation, or you think these are things that people don't really understand? Are you trying to just update people on the current state of the field, or what are you trying to do with this science communication?
Probably more informed because I think a lot of people are, especially now that there's kind of a big push for renewables, people are hearing a lot about this stuff, but
For sure.
it's basically a black box to most people. So I think having a little bit better understanding of how it works might make people also a little bit less reticent to embrace change if they have a better understanding, because people tend to fear the unknown. So I think being a little more sneaky about changing people's mind by informing them.
I like it. That's what I say about ecofiction all the time. It's the ninja of science communication. You don't know what's happening, and then but you have actually learned something by the end. I like that goal. I like that goal, to make people a little less reticent to embrace this change because you fear what you don't understand. So if you understand it, hey, bring on the renewables. I like it. I like it.
I don't know why I've never shared this story, but when I was growing up, there was one point where my mom would just like know random stuff, and there was one point where my dad just looks at her and says, "Why do you know all of this random stuff?" She's like, "Well, reading." It's like, "I don't see you reading nonfiction." She says, "No, I read fiction, but they put information in there, and I remember it." So,
Handy stuff. It's handy stuff, this fiction.
Mhm.
Are we at a point then where we start using this to create our own fiction, our own
I
starting point for the fiction?
I think so, unless there's something we missed. I think that covers the main points.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, that about sums us up for this first part of this episode of Spells and Specialists. Head on over directly to Clark's channel, The Magic Engineer, where we will be continuing this conversation all about all of this cool stuff that I cannot sum up in one sentence, even though I really should be able to by now. And we will be finding what is called a seed crystal, which is our point of inspiration for creating a magic system. And if you want to know more about what I just said, head on over to The Magic Engineer. But not before subscribing to Ecofictology, please, and liking, press the like button and everything. And I think that's all from us for this part.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Navarre, is there
Yeah.
any place that do you want people to find you?
Well, if you want to stay on YouTube after you visit Clark's channel, you can visit my channel, which is Solar Punk Station,
Yes.
which does not have a ton of videos yet, but I have over 100 articles now on my blog, which is also Solar Punk Station. So if you search that, most places all pop up. I think I'm also Bartz Navarre on Twitter. If you want to follow me there. I assume there'll be links in the description below.
Lots of links. Lots of links.
For things, so you can click down there.
Excellent. Well, this has been so much fun. Thank you so much for joining us, and sit tight, and we will be continuing this conversation in just a minute. And Clark is already excited. He's got the hands going. You always know when he's happy, when he's got hands going. Okay, well, that's all from us. So we'll see you next week, Ecofictologists.